Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Scott Anderson. He's a science journalist and an author. We're going to talk about his book, The Psychobiotic Revolution, and we're going to talk about what psychobiotics are, how they affect your brain health and your state of mind, and actually how they're connected to your microbiome as well. So, Scott, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this sounds really interesting. What is psychobiotics, and let's get into it.
Well, psychobiotics are a class of bacteria, or actually, let's say, microbes that help to improve your mood. So this is something that's kind of intriguing and actually quite surprising. And it started in about 2003 when a Japanese researcher named Sudo took some germ-free mice that have no germs whatsoever. They're born completely germ-free and have no bacteria in their guts. And he found out that their behavior was different. And that was a little shocking. Everybody was like, well, how could gut bacteria affect the behavior? And then he gave them bacteria to replenish the bacteria that they didn't have, and their behavior returned to normal. So that showed not only that there was a connection between bacteria and mood, but also that it was causal, that you could change it by getting rid of bacteria, for instance, through antibiotics, or by adding bacteria, for instance, through prebiotics or probiotics like yogurts and other fermented foods.
You said in that experiment, when the mice's demeanor changed, what did it change to when they were germ-free?
It was kind of complicated. They have a different response to stress when they have no bacteria. And that is one of the things that happened. They also found out that they were a little bit less curious about other mice. And there were some things that made them sort of antisocial. The behaviors were kind of strange, unexpected, but they were definitely connected to the lack or presence of these bacteria in the gut.
Okay. Got it. Well, yeah, keep going. So they did this experiment. They saw that there's a correlation. What other work has been done since to bolster it?
Well, so that was the first studies were done in mice, and it's easy to do those studies because mice can be made germ-free, but not many animals can be made germ-free. And also, if you've got a depressed mouse, that's one good thing, but we would like to see that it's better that it's helpful for humans as well. So the studies have gone on since then. In 2013, John Cryan and Ted Dinan, two researchers, and Catherine Stanton too, at University College Cork in Ireland, did a study, and they found that there were certain specific bacteria that did seem to have a correlation to the mood of the subject. And that again was being done with mice, but later on their studies have gone on to work with people as well. We're starting to see the same kind of result, namely that certain bacteria, namely things like Bifidobacteria longum and Lactobacillus rhamnosus, that those bacteria, for instance, have an impact on humans. And the impact is to reduce anxiety and to increase cognition in some cases. So different bacteria do different things, but the results are continuing to come in. It's hard still to be causal with the human studies. So we've got an association between bacteria and mood, but not necessarily causality yet. That's a harder thing to do in humans. But the idea that it's causal in mice makes you think that it would probably be causal in humans as well. But we need to have some randomized controlled trials to really determine that.
Well, what comes to mind is I remember hearing 80% of serotonin is made, quote unquote, in the gut. I don't know what creature is making it and how science knows that. What's your, how does that play into what you're talking about here? Is that true? What's the details?
It's very interesting. Serotonin, of course, is one of those drugs that's used to deal with depression. And it's kind of a complicated story, but we can talk about it and make sense of it here, one little bit at a time. Serotonin is made largely in the gut. 90%, probably more than your 80% figure, is made in the gut, and it's mostly to control contractions in the gut. So peristalsis, which is the movement of the gut that forces food through the gut, is controlled mostly by serotonin. So most of it's there. But in terms of how to get it to the brain, that's a trickier problem because the body is set up with a blood-brain barrier. And that blood-brain barrier is designed to not let things like serotonin and dopamine and other neurotransmitters, these are the chemicals that the brain uses to communicate one cell to another. Those things shouldn't get through the blood-brain barrier because they could cause havoc. And so it's hard to know exactly how serotonin or other chemicals that are created in the gut are getting into the brain. And it's an area of ongoing research, but we're finding out more and more about it all the time. So the idea of serotonin for antidepressants is that you can't give serotonin and expect it to get to the brain. Instead, what they give you is something called a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what that does, that can get through to your brain. That can pass through the blood-brain barrier. Once it's in the brain, it stops the uptake of serotonin, which means that there's an excess of serotonin in the brain. And that seems to help some people with depression. But it's still a kind of a dicey proposition because we don't know why serotonin would improve people's mood in the brain. It's not clear that a neurotransmitter, just topping off a neurotransmitter, would actually have that kind of an impact on the brain. So there's a lot of questions that are still involved with all of this. One of the things that we have seen, though, and some of this stuff is quite new, is that there seems to be a way for the gut to communicate with the brain through the vagus nerve. And it's been a little bit tricky to find out how all that's connected up, but we've now found all the cells that are responsible for communicating things that are going on, neurotransmitters and whatnot that are in the gut, transmitting them through the vagus nerve, which runs up to the brain. And if you cut the vagus nerve, a lot of these probiotics, a lot of these psychobiotic effects disappear. So we think that the vagus nerve is very important to all of this.
Well, do you think that actual molecules are being sent through the vagus nerve, or is the gut able to stimulate the brain in such a way through the vagus nerve that it informs it of how to act?
That's a really good question, and it's not clear exactly which one of those things is happening. My suspicion is that you're not actually sending molecules up through the vagus nerve, but rather you're sending nerve impulses that go up through the vagus nerve. So it is communicating something from the gut, and it's being interpreted in the brain in a certain way. And possibly what it's telling the gut, what the gut is telling the brain, and it's actually a two-way conversation. The brain talks to the gut as well. What may be communicated by this transmission is the state of the gut in terms of inflammation. And so one of the things that we think is happening is that when you have quote unquote dysbiosis, which means that your gut bacteria are not really working together as a team, when you have this sort of a bad mix of bacteria in your gut, it can lead to a leaky gut. And those leaks can let bacteria into your bloodstream. And once they're in your bloodstream, your heart just dutifully pumps them to every organ in your body. That can cause systemic inflammation. And inflammation over a long enough period of time can cause a lot of chronic diseases, maybe almost all chronic diseases. And that includes things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other things that affect the brain, but also things like diabetes and obesity and heart disease. So it's a very important juncture. Looking at how the gut is dealing with leakiness is very important in terms of your health. So that's one of the big things that we think may be motivating a lot of the impact of psychobiotics on the brain is basically by lowering inflammation.
So, okay, in particular, what is your research about then in the realm of psychobiotics? Are you looking for certain molecules and certain bacteria that create them, or are you looking at the whole ecosystem, or both?
Well, both things are happening. There is definitely a big push to look for the specific probiotics, the specific bacteria that are leading to a healthy gut and also leading to a healthy mood. But there's also some new research coming out. We've had a long time to look at how bacteria work. And as we do it, we find new ways of looking at things. So when we started all this stuff out, it was impossible to culture some 90% of the bacteria that we would find in the gut. So we couldn't put it into a petri dish and look at it that way. And that was the standard way of looking at bacteria. It took us a long time to get to a new stage, which is polymerase chain reaction, which is a way of examining the DNA. And when we did that, we looked at specific parts of bacteria, the parts that are kind of conserved through all bacteria and have very specific changes that identify which bacteria is which. And those studies led us to identify many, many more bacteria. That's where the other 90% of them bacteria that we couldn't see before all of a sudden became visible. But now we've gone at another stage, and that new step takes us to the metabolites. What are the bacteria producing? What molecules do they produce? And what molecules do they consume? And when you look at that, you start to see that may be getting us closer to the answers that we're looking for. In other words, the bacteria themselves may be very important, but a lot of bacteria can do very similar things. So you may be able to substitute one bacteria for another. But what is important is the metabolites they're producing. And by looking at those metabolites, we're starting to see much better correlations between the gut metabolites and the mood and also states of disease. So that's been a new study that came out of Belgium. And that was a very large study where they looked at not just the bacteria, but the metabolites themselves. And then they were able to backtrack that to say, okay, there are certain bacteria that we found that are very important in these metabolic pathways. And so the information that we're getting now, the way that we're looking at the bacteria, the way that we're looking at the metabolites, all of this stuff is getting us better and better refinement on which ones, which angles are really working and which ones are not.
But people have been able to look at the cycling of the prevalence of bacteria, before and after meals, diurnally, et cetera, and the production of metabolites, and the cycling of that.
Yes. And as a consequence, we're starting to fill in a lot of the details. Bacteria turn out to be a little bit promiscuous, and they will easily pick up an entire gene from another bacterium. So when they do that, all of a sudden they create new proteins. And it's hard now to figure out, well, exactly what kind, if a bifidobacter gets something from a lactobacillus, which is it now? And so you've got these bacteria that are kind of one thing, but because they have all these extra DNA, little chunks of DNA, these basically new genes, they are kind of a mix between different species. And so it becomes a little bit vague if you're just looking at the species of bacteria, but it becomes a lot more reasonable to understand what's going on when you look at the metabolites, because that's ultimately what these genes are creating, are the metabolites that in turn cause these changes through that get picked up and understood by the vagus nerve and transmitted to the brain.
So is it better to look at the gut as a job center for bacteria, or it's like a bazaar where they're trading resources? They're looking for stuff, and that's why they show up. They're altering and changing stuff and then giving back, stuff that they produce, metabolites.
I like the idea of a bazaar. I think that's great. It's kind of a bustling little community that's going on down there. So not only are genes being traded back and forth, but one bacteria's exudates, one bacteria's secretions will be another bacteria's food. And so they live together in these groups that are pretty well defined in terms of, one kind of needs another. And you rarely find some of these bacteria without their partner bacteria. And those partners can form large partnerships. And what these are called is they end up forming something called a biofilm. And biofilms are really interesting because when you get a certain number of bacteria together at certain quantities, they will start to issue something called a quorum molecule. And that tells everybody that they can form a biofilm. And they actually start to create these polymer, almost like buildings, with plumbing and ways for other metabolites to get through and to make sure that every part of the biofilm is getting nutrition. But these biofilms are very tough, and as a consequence, they are something that can be good or bad, but whether they're good or bad is compounded by the fact that they're very tough. A common biofilm that we think about all the time is plaque on your teeth and tartar on your teeth. That's a consequence of bacteria forming a group of pretty well-known now bacteria that work together to create something that becomes hard and hard enough that you have to scrape it off with a knife. So this sort of thing is probably going on all throughout your gut. In general, if you're healthy, then that biofilm can be a good thing. If you're not, if you've got Crohn's disease or if you've got ulcerative colitis, it could be part of the problem and why it's so hard to get rid of some of these terrible gut diseases.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Could you fluorescently tag various species that are really predominant in your gut and then try to image the structure of the biofilms to see if they're layered or interconnected or what they look like in the gut?
Yes, Richard, they've done exactly that. And what you can see is these beautiful, well, if you're a scientist like me, then they are beautiful. You got Corynebacteria forming these things that look like bushes with strands going out. And then at the end, instead of leaves, you've got other types of bacteria that are forming little nodules there. And it forms these structures that are quite lovely. And they are, and so we know a lot about those, and we're doing exactly what you said. They're fluorescently tagged and each in different colors, and you can just see these things in beautiful detail now.
Huh. Have you been able to use like fluoroscopy to watch someone, eating and watching how the biofilms move and change? And
I have not seen anybody do anything like that. It sounds like a fascinating idea. It's not clear though that biofilms move a lot. The current understanding is that they kind of get attached to their spot and grow there and sort of form a tough layer on top of the tissues.
Yeah, like if I eat a meal, who eats first? Do some bacteria work on it and then me and then back and forth? Like what's your thought?
Mostly what's going on in your gut is that you get first dibs on everything. So when you eat something, the sugars and the starches are all quickly absorbed in the small intestines. What's left over are these large, long-chain sugars called oligosaccharides. The popular name for that really is fiber. Fiber makes it can't be digested. You can't digest it with your enzymes or your acids. And it makes it all the way down to the colon. And at the colon, that's where all this fiber starts to feed the bacteria. They live for this fiber. And when they get it, they produce things like short chain fatty acids, such as butyrate. And these chemicals actually act as food for the cells lining your gut. And they also can help to heal the gut. So if there's a problem, this butyrate can go down there and really fix up holes, leakiness, and all of that stuff. So if you are not getting enough fiber, you're not getting this butyrate, and you're not getting that nourishment and that healing effect that comes from feeding fiber to your microbes.
So you're saying that our gut bacteria act as like a second stomach to further process parts of what we eat and then, allow us to access it nutritionally?
Yeah, and it's probably an evolutionary adaptation so that in cases where there is not a lot of food, fiber is not considered to be one of those delicious foods. In fact, that's why we've taken it out of everything. Fiber is, however, one of those things that if you don't have anything else and you are starving, then your microbes can produce these fatty acids that are actually quite nutritious and that add a lot of, it's a way of getting a little extra calories out of food that is not normally considered to be very nutritious. That's good if you're starving. It may be a big problem for humans today because we have so much food, and it may be part of the reason why we are becoming obese, is that we've got these very efficient bacteria trying to eke the last calorie out of every bit that we eat.
Yeah, going back to earlier, talking about psychobiotics, when you're talking about the different bacteria that are within us, I would think that if, obese people, I wish I'm probably classified to be one, have a certain predominant regime of bacteria in their gut versus thin people. And do we also see personality-wise or emotional states, let's say for obese people to be more negative or more a certain way than thin people, putting society aside, but just looking at it from the action of the bacteria?
Yeah, in fact, the idea of the jolly fat man is probably not right. Depression is strongly comorbid with obesity, which means that it occurs with obesity. In a lot of cases, you'll find depression and anxiety comes along with it. They have looked at the bacteria that are in thin people, and they have looked at the bacteria in fat people. And there are at least two bacteria that are associated with being lean. One of them is Christianella, and another one is Akkermansia. And those two are associated with the lean phenotype. Whether that means that they cause it or whether it means the other way around, that being skinny means that you get these bacteria, it's not clear yet. But we do know that not only does Christiansenella not only is it associated with the lean phenotype, but it also seems to be associated with families, and that somehow it's being passed down from mother to child.
Huh. Have you looked at people that are on a certain diet or change their diet? Let's say someone is doing like standard American diet and then goes keto or vegan for a period of 6 months. I'm sure people's gut bacteria have been sampled, but how about mood and other factors?
Yeah, what we're seeing is that indeed, when you change your diet within hours and definitely within days, your microbes will change to accommodate that. And it only makes sense. I mean, it's like putting growth media on a petri dish. You're going to grow certain kinds of bacteria that way. And we're doing the same thing. Our petri dish is our gut. And when we put in food, we are going to encourage the growth of some and not the growth of others. And so what we're seeing is that there is that correlation, and there is a correlation between the kinds of food that you're eating and your mood. We are seeing that. And for instance, people who are eating yogurt, for instance, have been shown to not only are we able to see changes in their brain and actual physical changes in their brain in terms of the size of their hippocampus or the size of their amygdala, but also we're able to see that there is using fMRI, functional MRI, we're able to watch what parts of the brain are lighting up, and we're able to see that based upon yogurt consumption or other fermented food consumption, different parts of the brain light up. And those people tend to have a greater resilience to stressful reactions, to stressful situations. So that we are seeing that. And another thing, and this is a little bit on the cutting edge of things and a little bit iffy. So don't quote me on this for any long period of time. But we are starting to see with fecal transplants. Fecal transplants are done in order to help people who are dying from a C. diff infection. And they are phenomenally successful at treating C. diff infections. So you take the fecal matter from a donor, and that donor has been checked over to make sure they don't have diseases, and that is injected into to the person who's suffering from C. diff, and it can, and 90% of the time it will cure them. And then the cure is quick, and within hours, these people are suddenly not suffering anymore. But some people have had changes in their mood. Some people who have been depressed for a long time all of a sudden feel better, and their depression is gone after a fecal transplant. So it's possible that we should not only be checking to see if they have any diseases, but the donor maybe should be checked for their mood as well, because that may get transferred along with the fecal matter.
So, I hope this would have happened, but people that have, treatment-resistant depression or just certain kinds of depression or PTSD, have a lot of them had their microbiome shotgun sequenced to look at the difference between people that are not depressed?
Yeah, there are some studies with that, and what we find is generally the same kind of thing, is that they're just loosely, generally speaking, it's been very, very difficult to tease apart the exact call it a signature, a bacterial signature that correlates to different types of things like PTSD or depression. One of the things that we've noticed is that people who are depressed or anxious seem to have, and this includes people with PTSD, seem to have a less diversity in their microbes. They seem to have fewer species than other people who are in better spirits. So that's the one thing that we kind of think is going on, but even that's kind of a slippery concept, because I've seen some recent studies showing that perhaps that's not always the case, that diversity is not always key. There have been some attempts along the way to come up with something called an enterotype, which is like, what type of gut do you have? And to categorize it into 3 or 4 or 5 different types of gut bacteria. But mostly that gets shut down, because the more we look into it, the more variety we find, and the harder it is to really nail down the specific species that might be responsible for mood or other aspects of your health.
Well, the species may not even matter, like you said, if they're exchanging plasmids all the time. So
exactly.
I mean, what is that? I've heard that a lot. Oh, the gut's more diverse. what does that mean? There's more different species that is a different metabolomic profile. I mean, what does diversity mean? And we got to zero in on this and see, okay, what's useful about it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of these things come back to ecology. When you look at the savanna and you look at the animals that live in the desert or that live in the jungle, and you start to see that there's a certain amount of animals that are necessary in order to have a well-balanced ecosystem. And if you start to take out key species, then the thing can fall apart and you get dominance of one particular species over another. You might, by taking out certain animals, you might end up having lions take over. And when the lions take over, that's not a good thing, because basically they will be having a hard time finding food and they'll be competing for that. But they leave the whole ecosystem in disarray. That's one of the things that we think is happening. When you have a more diverse microbiota, you've got more bacteria that are kind of forcing other bacteria to stay in line. It's not clear exactly how it all works out, but this is what we're coming to when we look at some of these things, is an ecological approach to the bacteria in the gut. And that seems to be helpful, but we still have a long ways to go on figuring this out. And as you said, Richard, the odds are good that we may never find anything that really summarizes all this in a neat way, especially if what we should be looking for is metabolites and not bacteria in the first place.
Well, I mean, I've seen this with cows. It's pretty gross. They'll have like literally a porthole into their stomach.
Right.
Could something be done with a cow or a mouse? You don't feed it for a day, then you feed it a meal, and over time you pull out bits of what it's eating and shotgun sequence, or like at least look at the metabolomics of what's going on as it's digesting a meal. Hour by hour. Let's say you take 3-4 samples, 6 samples, whatever it is, longitudinally in a short period of time, and look at the metabolomic profile. Maybe that would give you an idea of, okay, first this is happening, then this is happening, then this and this, and this correlates to the ability of these bacteria to digest this. And again, to answer like who eats first, the next, and maybe that would give you some idea on the function of what's going on.
Yeah, I've actually done some of these studies, not with cows, but with horses. And so we've been looking at some of that stuff for a long time now. And it's not clear exactly how, for instance, it's not clear how a cow relates to a human, because they have these 4 stomachs and they chew their cud. There's a lot of things that go on with cows that make them a little bit problematic for matching up to humans. But horses are a little bit better, but they also are strict vegetarians, and they get all of their energy from the microbial breakdown of cellulose and other things that produce these fatty acids that I was talking about. So most of the energy, most of the food sources that a horse gets is coming from microbial decomposition of the food. So we can look at some of that. Some of that's being done. Some of these studies have actually, one of the older studies is a soldier I take this back, not a soldier, but somebody who was injured in the Civil War ages. And at that time, he was not able to completely heal his gut wound. And a doctor figured out that he could use this as a way to look at how food gets digested. And so he would drop food into this hole, into this poor man's fistula, and he would see what happens. And he wasn't looking at bacteria, but he was looking at all the different stages. And we actually have learned a lot from that kind of horrible study. The guy himself was not really fond of this after a while and said, I think I've had this. I've had enough of this, and he bandaged himself up and walked away. But those studies are kind of being done. I think that the studies that are giving us the best information now are these metabolic studies. Unfortunately, they're expensive, so we just don't have a lot of them right now.
What studies do you think need to be done, and what needs to be elucidated?
I think that the studies that we want to be looking at are associational studies and causality studies that show which bacteria are actually producing the metabolites that we're interested in, to find out what those metabolites are. What exactly, it turns out bacteria can produce neurotransmitters. Why are they producing neurotransmitters? They don't have brains. Yet these are fairly, we kind of think of neurotransmitters as maybe some highfalutin molecule because, hey, it's involved with the way we think, and the brain is the pinnacle of all of creation, we think. It's not.
But wait a second. You said when a biofilm is set up, it can act as a temporary structure to accomplish a lot of higher functions, digestion, movement of materials. So why, maybe the neurotransmitters, and the speculation, maybe they are being used by the biofilm as like an impromptu communication network.
Richard, I think you're right. That's at least a lot of the consensus is that the bacteria are using these molecules that are basically evolutionarily conserved. They have been around forever. Even plants have some of these things. So we tend to get involved with how exotic neurochemicals are because it's our brain. But in fact, it's pretty widespread among all of the kingdoms of life. And you're probably right. The bacteria are using these neurotransmitters to talk with each other, but they're also using them to talk with us. And that seems to be unequivocal. How exactly they're talking to us is not clear, but it does seem there is a connection between cravings that we have and certain bacteria in the gut. So when you think that you really want a pizza or you really want a candy bar and you think it's you talking, it's quite likely that some of your bacteria are the ones that are actually controlling these cravings. And they're saying, this is what we need right now. And they're telling you that by giving you chemicals that make you hungry. And then when you eat the donut or whatever hits the sweet spot, then they'll produce dopamine. And that could easily be one of the ways that bacteria are controlling us in a sense. It's not clear that how big that effect is, but it does seem to be a real effect.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It is crazy.
So what's the overall goal with your research? Is it simply to understand what's going on, or is there a particular condition that, for some reason affects you personally that you want to help with? Do you know someone that's depressed, or what's driving you?
A lot of things, actually. As a scientist, of course, curiosity is one of those things that gets us into a lot of trouble. But it is absolutely fascinating to look at all these bacteria and to see the complexity that's there, and then to see some of the tools that we've got now that help us tear that complexity down. That's fascinating. On a personal level, I've always had a terrible gut. And recently I've figured out why and have fixed it. And I fixed it with a prebiotic, not a probiotic, a prebiotic called galacto oligosaccharide, which is one of those fibers that I mentioned earlier, an oligosaccharide that overnight changed my entire life. And it's 3 grams per day. And so you see what a small amount that it takes to have a huge impact on a person's gut. So I know that in our age that we have maybe 30% of the population is actually is actually somewhat healthy. The other 2/3 are overweight or obese. And these people are begging for some sort of a solution to all of this. So that's one of the things that I see out there is that we can make a lot of people happier with psychobiotics, and we may be able to make a lot of people healthier by making sure that their guts are no longer leaking bacteria and causing systemic inflammation.
Well, okay, if you don't mind maybe discussing your situation just a little bit. So you said your gut wasn't good. Like, what were you experiencing? And are you eating like a prebiotic powder with your meals? Like, what happened with you?
I have had probably irritable bowel syndrome. It was involved with, and I hope we don't lose a lot of your listeners here, but basically going to the bathroom 6, 7, 8 times a day, and diarrhea and misery. And everything in your life is planned around that because you have to be near a bathroom. And it is just miserable, and it's painful. And so I now take 3 grams of GOS with my coffee in the morning, and that's all. It's inexpensive and it's incredibly effective. I tried everything because I wrote this book, The Psychobiotic Revolution. I didn't want to have anything in there that I didn't have some familiarity with. So I went through almost every probiotic and prebiotic that's out there. And it's going to be the case that it's very personalized. It's very unique. Everybody's going to have a different little problem based upon their own genetic proclivities and how their gut bacteria got started in the first place. So you need to kind of look at what's out there, try things out, give it a couple of weeks, take notes, and you can figure out the one thing or the 2 or 3 things that are going to help you to live a better, healthier life. And that was a huge breakthrough for me. And when you find something like that, you want to tell everybody about it. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I've done a bunch of podcasts on IBD and Crohn's, and it affects a lot of people. Like you said, it's a terrible condition. There's a lot of researchers working on it. So I'm glad you spoke about it. It's important. I think people listening, if they have a problem, you may have just given them a way to figure out how to help themselves. So it's good.
Yeah, I hope so. It's a miserable condition.
What do you think happened, though? So you took this prebiotic, it acted as food for a particular, set of microbes within your gut. And then what? You think that they produced, an SCFA that you needed, or what do you think happened?
I don't know exactly. I know that GOS, the galacto oligosaccharide, feeds a specific species of bacteria called or genre of bacteria called Bifidobacter, and that is something that you get with mother's milk. It's one of the earliest sets of bacteria that you get. You get lactobacillus and you get bifidobacter when you are a baby from mother's milk, even from formula. Those are the two bacteria that are the most prominent when you're a baby. I don't know what happened to me, but I was sick from the day that I was born. My mom wanted to take me back. It's like, this baby is coming out of both ends. And so I don't know whether I missed it. I don't know what caused that. It could have been antibiotics. Antibiotics were very popular then. That could have just wiped out my system. But for whatever reason, I suffered through this for years. And all the doctors would say, well, what you need to do is drink more milk. Well, it turned out I was lactose intolerant. So that was not helpful. Or you need to stop eating spicy foods. Well, I have no idea where that comes from, but that had nothing to do with anything. And it just took all these years of trying to figure it out. And then all of a sudden, wham, this galacto oligosaccharide just turned my life around. And so now I go to the bathroom once in the morning and clean it up with a whisk broom, and we're all done. It's real simple. It's amazing. This is what other people apparently do that are healthy. And it's something I had never been familiar with before. So it's opened up my life and made a big difference. I know that it feeds bifidobacteria. I don't know what the bifidobacteria is doing, but I imagine when I take this that it's causing a bloom of bifido. And that bifido is then balancing out something in my gut that makes everything start to work better. And all of a sudden, I'm just like a normal person. So it was a huge revelation to me, and was a big part of why I ended up writing this book.
So you didn't change your diet at all? It was just the addition of this?
Well, I have been changing my diet continuously as new things come in. So as a scientist, you're always looking at things and saying, well, is that really going to work out or something? And I like to try these things, to within limits. I don't want to go crazy on things, but I have added much more fiber into my diet. I cook for myself. We don't have fast food anymore. We minimize refined starches. In fact, there are really no refined starches left in my diet whatsoever. So if you're going to eat bread, it's always going to be whole wheat bread, or something even, with more stuff in its seeds and whatnot. And minimize the amount of meat that you eat. Eat a little bit more fish, because fish has omega-3s, and omega-3s have an anti-inflammatory effect. And so there are just several things that and if you look in the book, you'll see that I do talk about certain dietary changes that you can do. And I can talk about them from a point of view of actually knowing what I'm talking about, because I do it myself. And it has made everything a lot better. But none of those things actually did as much as this simple 3 grams of GOS in the morning, which is shocking. But now that all of these things are together, I am in much better shape, and my mood has improved too.
Have there been studies, or would you be able to put on a study you think would be, I don't know how tough an IRB it would be, but, to have people that sign up and say, yes, I have treatment-resistant depression, and then to give them a series of prebiotics on a regular basis for a month and see if it helps their mood?
Yeah, that is actually going on. One of my co-authors, Ted Dinan, is a psychiatrist, and he has several patients who, for one reason or another, are not into taking antidepressant drugs. And so he is working with some of them to give them probiotics instead, and he's getting some fantastic results out of that. It is really working for a lot of his patients.
Oh, is it prebiotics or probiotics or both?
It's both. Mostly he's giving probiotics. He's giving Lactobacillus rhamnosus is one of the popular ones that he's giving, but he's also encouraging people to try fermented foods like yogurt and sauerkraut. We know if you look at some other cultures that are around the world, like in Korea, you might get a little sauerkraut, some kimchi with your dinner. And instead of it just being a blob of sauerkraut, it's actually 4 or 5 different little spoonfuls of different kinds of kimchi. And that may be an attempt to increase the diversity of bacteria in your gut. So it's helpful to look at what other cultures have done over thousands of years of figuring out how to do it right, and compare that to what we do in the United States, where we have almost zero, culinary heritage. And we just mix things together without any kind of an idea of what really goes together. So you look at the places that are doing well with good microbes, good guts, and good mood. And there are places like the Mediterranean diet, the Nordic diet, and the Japanese diet, where people live to be into their hundreds and they're healthy all the way through and they're happier than most. And if you look at that, you realize, okay, these people had plenty of time, thousands of years, to figure out what to do with their local fauna and flora to create a balanced diet. That's not what we do, and to get back to something like that. So I would recommend, if you want to improve your mood and your health, going with something like a Mediterranean or Japanese type diet. The Japanese diet may be a little different. They actually have new genes that are specifically there to digest seaweed. So they may have they may not be as appropriate for, their diet may not be as appropriate for the Caucasians in this country, but it's still something to look at in terms of an overall plan that doesn't just say, oh, let's just, all I want to do is eat McDonald's burgers. Don't bother me with anything else. That's the sort of thing that we're doing in this country that is making us all really sick. So we would do quite well to actually look at some of these other cultures that have had a long time to put together a rounded diet.
How can people find out more about what you're doing? They can get your book perhaps on Amazon, and what website can they go to? Like, how can they find out more?
Yeah, the book is on Amazon, The Psychobiotic Revolution, and it is also there's also a website, and it is the psychobioticrevolution.com. And it's actually, what I'm seeing here is psychobiotic-revolution.com. Let's see what happens if we get rid of that dash. And that's the website that will take them to all sorts of, both will work. Psychobioticrevolution.com. And that's where you will find all sorts of new articles on a more or less weekly basis, talking about the latest and greatest research that is going on with psychobiotics and other things involved with the gut-brain axis. So the latest is always there.
Okay. Well, very good. And last thing, is there any of the major questions that you're trying to answer that I haven't asked you about? Or can we recap for a moment? What main things would you like to answer with your research in the next 5-10 years?
I actually would like to get down to the metabolics of what's going on in the gut. I think that's where the most exciting research is going to happen. We're getting these mixed messages when we look at the bacteria, and I'd like to see the fuzziness clear up a little bit. So the metabolic analysis is what's in the future. It's expensive right now. I can't afford it myself. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can, that price is coming down. It's coming down on a daily basis, but it's not quite yet within my budget. But I'm going to keep looking at that. And that's where we're going to find, I think that's where we're going to find the most amazing things.
Well, very good. Scott, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius Podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius Podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.